I grew up in the Oakland Hills. I remember as a kid walking to the end of the street and overlooking the Caldecott Tunnel and this house that was just burnt down to a foundation, and I never really knew exactly what happened until I started doing research for this video. The Oakland Hills Fire that we're going to talk about today killed 25 people, did $3.9 billion of damage, burned almost 3,500 homes to the ground, and is one of the most costly and deadly fires in the history of California. And the crazy thing is, it happened over the course of only 72 hours. Today we're going to be talking about the Oakland Hills Fire of 1991 and the 100+ years of decisions that led to this tragedy and what we can learn from this going forward when it comes to fire management and fire reduction. Growing up in the Bay Area, there was always this plant that you would see everywhere. It is growing in ditches, it's growing on the side of the road, and it's a beautiful tree. And I always just kind of assumed that whenever you see a tree that's around so frequently, you just kind of assume that it's native. And I always thought that this tree was a native California plant. It's not. It was the Blue Gum Eucalyptus tree, and it is literally everywhere. This is a tree that dates back in California to the gold rush, when during those times, things were taking off so rapidly. People from all across the world were trying to come to the Bay Area in California to try to take advantage of this gold rush. So they needed to build rapidly. And the way they were going to do that is by using eucalyptus lumber to build a lot of the infrastructure that was going to be needed for this population boom that was incoming. And since California has a very similar climate to what was found in Australia, people at the time thought it might be a good way to bring the eucalyptus tree over and use it as a timber source for the foreseeable future. The problem is that once they realized what happens when you dry out the timber, it has a tendency to curl and twist, which makes it not very usable for the types of railroad building, houses, buildings. So it became a timber that was not very useful to the people that brought it across the Pacific Ocean in the first place. And since that point, eucalyptus, because of its similar climate to Australia, has done very well, and it is pretty much found everywhere. And according to the state of California, it is a moderate invasive species. Besides its prevalency, the thing that makes this a really nasty invasive species has to do with its reactions to being caught on fire. California is an area that burns down frequently, and eucalyptus is a tree that is very flammable. The sap that the tree produces allows the trees to go up rapidly, and the peely bark, which is a pretty common characteristic that you'd find with eucalyptus trees, the tree tends to shoot off that bark up to 100 yards in any direction, which is a really easy way for the fires to spread rapidly. So now in the California Bay Area, you have these very flammable eucalyptus trees growing pretty much everywhere. And now we go to October of 1991, where a small brush fire breaks out in the Oakland Hills that is put out pretty quickly. This was a day that there was not much wind, and the fire crews that came in handled it pretty easily. The problem is that there were still some embers that were smoldering from the previous night when, the next morning, the fire reignited. However, on this second day, the weather was much worse for fire conditions. You have winds blowing 65 miles an hour that made it so that this fire that was very contained in the first day spreads rapidly in conjunction with these eucalyptus trees that are very flammable and shoot these basically flaming pieces of bark up to 100 yards in any direction that causes the fire to spread rapidly. In this area, you have winds called the Diablo winds that are coming from the mountain range to the east of the Bay Area, which brings this very warm, dry air, similar to what you have with the Santa Ana winds down in Southern California, that brings these hot, dry winds, comes over the Oakland Hills and meets the cold, wet air coming from the bay and gets this very unpredictable pattern of winds. So you have these very strong winds that are kind of swirling. It makes it so it's very difficult to predict which way the wind is going to be blowing at any given time, and allows this fire to spread rapidly. And then we get something that's called a firestorm. A firestorm is a fire that's so severe and intense that it creates its own weather conditions inside of it, and it makes it even less predictable to decide which way the fire is going to spread. As fire management goes, you're able to mitigate some of the damage by having stuff burnt before the fire can actually get there to make sure that the fuel sources are limited by the time the main fire gets there. When you have a firestorm and you can't predict which way it's going to go, it makes it very difficult to manage and put out the fire eventually. This wind and firestorm was so intense that it allowed the fire to cross Highway 24, which, if you've been to the Bay Area and you've gone across this highway, this is an 8-lane highway that seems so unlikely for a fire to be able to jump across it, but it was able to because of these conditions. By the end of this, it only took a weekend for this fire to do the damage that it caused. It took 400 fire engines, 1,500 crew members, and 250 agencies collaborating to put out the fire. This fire is a great example of some of the very common things that we see with fires nowadays, and the first and most important one is a result of human impacts. Obviously, you have this eucalyptus tree, this incredibly flammable tree that was planted in this area to try to be used as a timber source. When it was no longer valuable for that, it allowed it to grow rapidly out of control and you have this crazy fire source in an area that has unpredictable winds during these early fall, late summer months. And then that goes in conjunction with some problems that happened during this fire. We have cars parked in front of fire hydrants. You have a city that doesn't have a unified standard of what size the nozzle adapters will be. So when you have these 250 agencies coming to help put out this fire, a lot of their hoses were not compatible with the fire hydrants that were found. Also, you have power lines going out, which made it so the reservoirs that were drained in the process of trying to put out this fire were unable to be replenished. And you just have a situation where this incredibly dangerous fire just gets even worse as a result of human actions. Fires and the intensity of fires have increased for the past century. When you look at it, in the past 20 years, fire frequency has increased 3% every year, and it is on a trajectory to make it to the point where fires are going to be something that we deal with constantly. Put this with the fact that 85% of fires are human caused, you have a situation where things are going to get much worse. A very famous fire in the Portland area is the Eagle Creek Fire in 2017 that caused the Columbia Gorge to basically burn to the ground, and that was caused by a 15-year-old boy lighting off fireworks during a time where there was an overall fire ban. So with fires being started more and more frequently by humans, we need to put something in place to try to stop this. Fire is an important part to the circle of life. It allows for forests to restart, and areas that have been previously overgrown by undesirable species get burnt out and are able to be replenished by native species. You have some species that are 100% reliant on these fires to reproduce. You have something like the lodgepole pine, which is Pinus contorta, which needs the hot temperatures of the fire to melt the resin that binds its pine cones to be able to reproduce successfully. That's why when you see areas that were recently burnt, you'll see pine forests popping up because they are just kind of waiting for fires to come through. And when these fires are happening less and less frequently, you have this fuel supply that just continues to build. And when it eventually does burn, it burns more intense than the humans can handle to try to put out, and causes massive damage to not only the forest, because they're not designed to be able to withstand these crazy intense fires. They're more designed to handle these much less intense and less frequent burns. So that's why fire management and fire reduction tactics are so important. This can be something like cutting down dead trees and chipping them. It can be pruning. It can be controlled burns to make it so that the fuel sources are not just building up over years and years. And when you have a lack of those practices, that's what resulted in this incredibly destructive and deadly fire in 1991. When you compare this fire to the other fires in California history, actually it's worldwide, but it's just that California has all of the most devastating fires, there's something that's very different about this fire compared to the other ones, and that's when you look at the acreage burned. You have just around 1,000 acres burned for this fire over the course of 72 hours, compared to some of the other fires that have only happened in the past 5 years. You see that this is a very common problem that's going to continue to get worse over time. So this is why fighting climate change is so important. This is a positive feedback loop that as the planet continues to warm, fires are going to be more and more frequent, and as you have more fires, more carbon dioxide is going to be released into the atmosphere, which is going to make it worse and worse. And that's why we need to take a stand now and why we need to have action on climate change. So this is the story of the Oakland Hills Fire that burned down my neighborhood back in 1991, 5 years before I eventually moved in there with my family. And this was a story that I never really knew was based on an invasive tree, the Blue Gum Eucalyptus, that was brought in the gold rush to try to be a timber source for the expanding population. Decided that it was not actually a good timber source and allowed it to reproduce rapidly and get out of control. You have this tree that is very easy to light on fire and spread fires in an area that's going to continue to get damaged by these intense fires in the foreseeable future. So this is a story of how you have one of the most destructive fires in the history of the world happen in only 72 hours, and it's something that happened right in my backyard. So if you have any other topics that you'd like me to hear my thoughts on, be sure to leave them in the comments down below. And I've left additional information about this fire, fire reduction, the Blue Gum Eucalyptus in the description if you want to read up more on that. Thanks for watching. I appreciate all the support, and I'll see you in the next video.